Okay, so good morning everyone and good day everyone. Our lesson for today is all about sampling techniques. So before we start the discussion, let me introduce our objectives for today or the ILOs. So intended learning outcomes or the ILOs. At the end of the discussion, the students must be able to do the following. First is define random sampling. Second is enumerate the types of random sampling. And third is identify the common problems to be aware of random sampling. Again, at the end of the discussion, the students must be able to do the following. First is define random sampling. Second is enumerate the types of random sampling. And third is identify the common problems to be aware of random sampling. Okay, so before we proceed to our discussion, let us review first about the definition of population and sample. So again, when we say population, it is the entire group. And when we say sample, it is a collected data from the population. So sample, gikuha rin na siya sa population. That is why sample is always less than from the population. So sample, gamay ra jud na siya kaysa sa population. Okay, the sample should have the same characteristics as the population it is representing. So meaning, a sample should have the same characteristics as the population. That is why most researchers and statisticians uses different methods in random sampling in attempt to achieve their goal. So statisticians and researchers uses different random sampling techniques. It is because they will make sure that the sample is representing the characteristics of the population. So if we have sample, it should represent the whole population. Even it's a gamay ra na siya sa population, but we make sure that sample will be the representation of the population. Okay, so there are several methods in random sampling. So as what I've said, that most researchers and statisticians uses different random sampling techniques. In any form of random sampling, every member of the population is initially given a chance to be selected from the sample. So always remember that every member or individual of the population has a chance to be selected, because we want to have a sample that will represent the population. That is why we need to use random sampling techniques, that is every member will have a chance to be selected. So for example, BSHM students, so 60 BSHM students, and then we need to get a 10 random students in BSHM. So we need to have a random representation. So random representation means that every student in BSHM has a chance to be selected from the data, to be selected as becoming a sample. And 10 students will become a representation of whole BSHM1 student. Okay, so simple random sampling. So when we say simple random sampling, the term means that each unit or individual in the selected population has the equal chance of the selection. So every member of the population has the chance to be selected. So walay bias. Wala tayo maingon na, kanirang top 10 na tong kwaon. So ang simple random sampling, lahi na siya. So it means that every member of the population has a chance to be selected. So muna siya, ang ubang teachers bunot-bunot. So they will write all the names of the students, of BSHM1 students for example, and then they will choose 10 students to be selected as the sample. So magbunot-bunot na siya. And that is simple random sampling. So the key to random selection is that there is no bias involved in the selection of sample. So, through that simple random sampling, there is no bias. Walay bias mahitabo. Mingon, dili na nato mingon na apilion ra nako akong ganahan na student. No. Simple random sampling gani kay no bias. So, kung kinsay mabunutan, mura to'y tawgon. Like that. That is simple random sampling. So, there are types of random sampling. So, there are 3 types of random sampling. First is cluster sampling. Second is stratified sampling. And third is systematic sampling. Again, there are 3 types of random sampling. So, these are cluster sampling, stratified sampling, and systematic sampling. When we say cluster sampling, it is a sampling method in which groups, not individual. So, groups siya, by group siya, dili siya individual ang pagkuha sa sample. It is, and the group will be randomly selected. All the members of the selected groups have the same similar characteristics. So, meaning, each group has similar characteristics. So, cluster sampling is more convenient when the population is very large or spread over geographical area. So, random sampling, we use this one if the population is very large. And also, if the geographical area is large also. Especially in the Philippines, we are divided by regions. And our geographical area is very large. So, the common sampling method that we used, if we used some surveys, we used cluster sampling. Okay, so divide the population into groups or clusters and then randomly choose from the clusters. And all the members of this group are called cluster sample. So again, when we say cluster sampling, it is a group or clusters, by group or clusters, and we need to have the same characteristics of each group. And then all the members of this group are also called as cluster sample. Okay, next is stratified sample. When we say stratified sample, it is to make a stratified sample, we must divide the population into strata or groups. So the same siya sa cluster method, but then we need to divide by strata. And we take the proportion number from each stratum. So we will just get the proportional of the each stratum or each group. Unlike sa cluster, so we are present, the characteristic is the same man. So sa cluster method, kantanan sa group sa cluster will become a sample. So stratified meaning the group imo pa dyan na siyang proportional. Imo siyang kwaon. And then magkuha na ka dito para sa sampling method. For example, the student population by program, BIS-INT, BIS-HM, and BEd. And choose a simple random sample. So, we will use stratified sample for this. Then, number each student in program. So, to look a program, which is the BIS-INT, BIS-HM, and BEd. And then, after that, we need to number each student in the program. And then, after that, we will pick numbers from different programs and it will become represents of the population. For example, sa BIS-INT, so for example, 200 students in BIS-INT. So, I will write all the students in BIS-INT and then also in BIS-HM and BEd. And then I will just mag-random ra kog pick og numbers, and for those students na ma-pick ang numbers, they will become the sample of the group. So, that is stratified sample. So, the group na to, the group na ko from BIS-INT, BIS-HM to BEd, and then after that, nagkuha pa dyan ta sa by group. Muna siya stratified. Unlike sa cluster, ang group mo yung nahimog sample. And the next is systematic sampling or systematic sample. So, it randomly choose a starting point and take every nth element from the data from a listing population. So, we get the nth element. So, depende na nimo kung unsa na nth element. So, by 3 ba? By 4 ba? So, it depends on the statistician or the researcher what nth element they will be used. So, for example, you have to do a survey. Your master list contains 1,200 residents listing. So, you will conduct a survey and then you have 1,200 resident listing. And you must select 40 names for the sample. So, mag-select ra kag 40 names. So, how to do that? So, using systematic sampling, so using that, so number the population from 1 to 1,200. Then use simple random where you choose every 30th name until you can get 40. So, maglist ka sa 1 to 1,200 residents, and then after that you will choose every 30th name until you can get 40. That is systematic sample. Unlike sa stratified sample, we just divide the population by group, and then gikuha nato siya by group. So nagkuha taog sample sa group. And then when we say cluster, ang tibuok na jud na group ang atong gihimo og sample. Systematic sample, we list all the residents of the listing, and then after that one, we get 40 by giving nth term or by giving the 30th name. So at every 30th name, they will become the sample. So that is why this sampling techniques is very important because it is no bias. Walay bias may tabo. Dili na ma-error. Because every member of this the population has given a chance to be selected. Because we want to achieve our goal, which is we need to have a sample that is the same characteristics of the population. So again, there are 3 sampling techniques. So these are cluster sampling, and then stratified sample, and systematic sample. Next is convenience sampling. So when we say convenience sampling, it is a non-random type subsampling. So it is not na random type. So wala tay dili ta magamit og simple random techniques for this. It just means that using finding which are readily available. Kung kinsa lay available, mo na atong himong sample. But again, this convenience sampling technique is not common. It's very rare lang siya because there is a big chance that it will be biased or the sampling is error. Okay, so we should always take note that sampling data should be done carefully. It should be done carefully. Careless collection of data can have an erroneous result. So that's why we need to be careful in getting sampling. Each sampling, we need to be careful. We need to be because if we are careless, our data will be error. Ma-error jud siya. Muna siyang as a statistician or a research, if we do some surveys or researches, we need to be careful enough in sampling. Kaya kung lahi ang sampling na ito makuha, error po ang atong result na makuha. We should always remember that. So, when we say sampling errors, in reality, a sample is not exactly the representation of the population. So, there's always a sampling error. As a rule, increasing the numbers of samples lessen the sampling error. So, sa tinuod lang, so sampling error is very common. But then, we need to have a sampling error as small as possible. Because again, we want to represent the sample as the same characteristics of the population. However, if there's a sampling errors, it's normal. But then again, we need to be make sure that the sampling error is very least. Gamay ra jud siya. So that's why it's one of the rule is that we need to increase the sample in order that we can lessen the sampling error. Okay, so sampling bias. So it happens when a sample is gathered from the population. And some members of the population are not given an equal chance to be selected as sample. When sampling bias happens, a wrong conclusion can be drawn about the population that is being studied. So, sampling bias means that there is no chance that each individual or member of the group will be selected. For example, manguha ra kog akong kaila. So, there's a big chance that your conclusion will be false. Dili mao ang nakuha because we are being biased of our sample. Nangita ra namili ra tag pila ka buok natong kaila. Wala ta nagamit og mga random sampling techniques. So sampling bias will be the conclusion for this will be false. Dili matinuod kay nagbias naman ta sa tong sampling. Namili ra man ta. Dili nato na wala ta nagrepresent na sampling is not representation of the population. That's why sampling bias. Okay, so critical evaluation. So we need to evaluate critically of our sampling. So before accepting any result of a statistical study, we need to be critical, evaluate, and analyze. We need to evaluate and analyze our sampling in order that we can have a good sampling sample of our population. So the following are the common problems to be aware of. So first is problems with sample. Second is self-selected sample. Third is sample size issues. Fourth is unique influence. Fifth is non-response or denial of participation. Sixth is causality. Seventh is self-funded or self-interested studies. Eighth is misleading use of data. And ninth is confounding. Again, there are common problems to be aware in sampling. Okay, so first is problems with sample. Second is self-selected sample. Third is sample size issues. Fourth is unique influence. Fifth is non-response or denial of participation. Sixth is causality. Seventh is self-funded or self-interested studies. And eighth is misleading use of data and confounding. So first is problems with samples. A sample should be true representative of the population. A sample is biased, which is not representative of the population. Biased samples that are not representative of the population give inaccurate or invalid results. So, if we have a problem with our sample, we choose our sample, we are being biased of our sample, there's a big chance that our sample is not representative of the population. Okay, so that's why our conclusion or the result of our survey or researches will be inaccurate and invalid result. Second is self-selected samples. The responses are often unreliable only by individuals who choose to respond, such as in call-in surveys. So mamili, this is a big bias for this because we are just choosing our sample. Mamili ra tag 10 kabok natong kaila. So that is self-selected samples. That is also error. And then next is sample size issue. So sample size issue, excessively small samples may be unreliable. So it is unreliable if our sample is very small, is if gamay ra. Where possible, larger samples are better. So if it has a larger sample, it has a bigger chance that our sample represents our population. So limited samples are common in certain cases and can still be used to draw conclusions, even though larger samples are better. So if we have limited samples, it's common to cases that we can draw conclusion. However, if the larger the sample, the better. Kung dako ang sample, mas better siya. We can get the better result of our researches or surveys. Fourth is unique influence. So when we say unique influence, it is collecting data or asking question in a way that affects the response. So it's very common in interviewing sample. If we want to interview sample and then in asking questions, na affect siya sa pag-response sa ilang question. So dapat if we want to ask questions in our surveys or interview, we need to be careful because there's a chance that the response of our of the person will be affected. And then fifth is non-response or denial participation. This is very common. If we choose sampling and then if we choose the 30 random sample of residents of the Hinabuyan, Villaba, Leyte, and then one of that will be non-response, dili mo participate, or denial mo participate. So that is one of the error also. So the response obtained can no longer be representative of the population. So if daghan mo dili mo response sa ato ang interview or survey, so there's a chance that it will not be a representative of our population anymore. People with strong positive or negative opinion can be often respond to survey, which may affect the outcome. So if we do some interviews or some surveys, so if the people will have a strong positive or negative opinion, so there is a chance that our data will be affected. So that's why it's very common error. And the next is causality. When we say causality, a relationship between two variables will not automatically mean that one affects other. So if we have two variables, so we should not always know that these two variables will automatically affects each other. So because of the relationship, they can be both relative via separate variables. So we need to be careful in giving and in separating variables. So dili na to una-unaon na kung naay two variables, it means that na-affect na siya each other. So it's not. And then seventh is self-funded or self-interested studies. So a study carried out by a person or group to support their argument. So maghimo sila study, maghimo sila researches para mingon we do some researches that is like that. And then the result is good for them. But then there's error also because there's a chance that ilang himo-himuan og conclusion from that research or survey. So that's why it's error also, self-funded or self-interested studies. And then 8 is misleading use of data. So when we say misleading use of data, graph presented incorrectly, incomplete data, lack of meaning. So if the data is lacking, so lack of meaning, lack of data, gamay ran data nakuha, that is misleading use of data. Or even graph. So if graph is not correctly represent the data, it's misleading use of data. And last is confounding. When we say confounding, confusion make it difficult or impossible to draw valid conclusion about each factor's effect. So if there's a conclusion happen, it's difficult for us to know the data, know the valid conclusion because nag-confound naman ta, na-confuse naman ta unsay nahitabo, and that is one of the error also. So again, there are 9 errors. There are 9 common problems to be aware in random sampling. So these are problem with sample, self-selected sample, sample size issues, so unique influence, non-response or denial of participation, causality, self-funded or self-interested studies, misleading use of data, and confounding. So that's the sampling techniques. So thank you so much and God bless us all.